Hi guys, this first video is just going to go through the Google slides, and I'm going to kind of give you the Heather Gullo version of what's going on in these slides. There are quite a few. This is going to take a minute because we're going to go all the way from Germany ending World War I to the rise of Hitler, and it's a lot to cover, and we're going to do it as fast as we can. So the name of this Google Slides presentation is the Weimar Republic, Germany's government from November of 1918 until January until 1933. And the end of World War I is another way of looking at it, to the rise of Hitler. The Weimar Republic, like I said, was set up at the end of World War I. It had a constitution that was finally agreed to in August of 1919, so just about a year later. The new constitution faced opposition from both sides of the political spectrum. People on the left didn't like it because they didn't think it was liberal enough, and people on the right didn't like it because they didn't think it was conservative enough. There were very few people kind of right down the middle in that Goldilocks lane where that thought it was just right. The Weimar Constitution had 181 provisions, 181 pieces. I am not going to make you learn all of them. I'm just going to go through a few of the top money makers here. In Germany, because of the Weimar Constitution, there was a president, a chancellor, and parliament. The parliament was called the Reichstag, and it was bicameral. That means it has two houses, just like we have in our Congress. We have the House of Representatives and a Senate. The same thing in Germany. The difference is they have a president who's elected, who's kind of sort of in charge, and then a chancellor who's appointed by the president. The chancellor has the real work to do. Otto von Bismarck is a chancellor's name you might remember from a few months ago, and also the current chancellor of Germany, and she's almost done with her years of service. Her name is Angela Merkel. Another provision in the Constitution is that elections were proportional. If your party got 10% of the vote, you got 10% of the seats in the Reichstag. Voting age was 20. You may think, oh, that's not fair, it's 18 here. It wasn't 18 here until after the Vietnam War. It used to be 21. So they're actually a little more liberal in their voting than we were. Each representative in the Reichstag had a 4-year term, and the president had a 7-year term. Now that's a little different than ours. Our representatives have a 2-year term if you're in the House of Representatives, and a 6-year term in the Senate. And our president has a 4-year term with the option of running for another 4 years. All of the president's orders have to be agreed to by the chancellor. And this one right here, this bullet's going to be really important. The president can suspend civil rights in an emergency. They never spell out exactly what an emergency is, but they can stop them if they need to in an emergency. All Germans are equal and have the same civil rights and responsibilities. That goes way further than the U.S. Constitution in 1920 or 1919. Germans have freedom of expression, they have freedom of assembly, they have freedom of religion, they have the freedom to own property, they have the right to employment, equal opportunities to employment, and equal opportunities to wages. Again, going way further than the U.S. did at that time. Also, it had free and mandatory public education. So everybody had to go to school, and all school was free. Even college was free.
Or look at the dog.
So the Weimar Republic had people who were like, yay, gung-ho, and people who were against it. There were lots of reasons why it was unpopular. One of their first acts was that the Weimar Republic signed the armistice that ended the war. Now this had people kind of spitting nails because this agreement to stop fighting came when Germany still occupied French territory. So we know this from our previous unit, well, 2 units ago. The Weimar was unpopular because they signed the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was really controversial to Germany. They punished Germany harshly for its participation in World War I. They signed a war guilt clause. They lost territory in their colonies. They lost their military. And kind of the biggest problem they had is they signed an agreement to pay reparations. They paid off their enemies' war debts, but their enemies never told them how much those war debts would be. So they ended up signing a blank check, giving the Allies the ability to say, we'll let you know when you've paid off your debt. They also lost control of their coal mines and their rivers and their factories and their taxes, but these are kind of the top ones. The Weimar Republic was unpopular because it was the first time Germans were practicing using democracy. You guys know when you're a senior, you have to take a class called Participation in Government, or Participation in Democracy, some schools call it. You can't just throw people into democracy and say, good luck, hope it goes well. Democracy takes practice. That's why we have elections in school and why we have a student council and why we get to have votes on what our themes are going to be for dances. And many people in Germany didn't know how to do this, and they wanted to go back to having a strong single leader like the king, like the Kaiser. The government was inefficient. Because it was a parliamentary republic, Parliament's leader was chosen by the party that had the most votes. Now, the political party that got to choose the chancellor, or choose the president, had to have the majority of the votes, but there were lots and lots of political parties. We have, in the United States, we have two dominant political parties today. We have the Republicans and the Democrats. In Germany, there were dozens and dozens of political parties. There was the Martha Karns party and the Heather Gullo party and the, I like to wear plaid pants on Tuesday party. And it was really hard because there were so many parties for any group to get 50% of the vote. So that forced different political parties to form coalitions. They had to work together to get 50%. Because coalition parties didn't always see eye to eye, they often fell apart. And then they'd have to vote all over again to have leadership. So it was really inefficient. The Weimar Republic was also unpopular because of inflation, hyperinflation. You've probably heard your parents talk about, or even your grandparents talk about, oh, when I was a kid, candy bars cost a nickel. That's inflation. Things generally cost more as time goes by. In Germany, however, in the 1920s, they were experiencing a period called hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is when inflation is out of control. In Germany, this happened because the Weimar Republic had to pay these reparations. They had to pay off the Allies for their war debts. But the Germans didn't have trade. They didn't have factories. Their infrastructure was ruined. Their roads were ruined. Their canals were ruined. Their railroads were ruined. And it was impossible to make the money they need to pay off the Allies and have food for their regular people. So the Weimar Republic had the bright idea, hey, if we owe you $20, let's just print off, ka-chunk, 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 $20. The only way to pay off the debt was to print money, and print money, and print money, and print money. And pretty soon this made it so the money was worthless. If you just keep forking it out, you know it's going to be worth nothing. Just like toilet paper during this pandemic. If you had asked me 6 weeks ago, hey, how much would you pay for toilet paper? I'd be like, I don't know, probably $1 a roll. Now people are selling rolls of toilet paper on the internet for $5 or $6 or $7 because of its scarcity. In Weimar, Germany, money wasn't scarce. At one point in Germany, inflation was 121% a day. That means if on Sunday, like today, a cup of coffee costs $1, tomorrow it's going to cost $121. And you're going to click on this video and watch some illustrations and explanations of hyperinflation. It's really short, a couple minutes long, and these images will look familiar to you when you're done watching it. Now, the rest of the world realized, holy moly, the Weimar government needs help. So in 1923, some countries came to their rescue. In 1923, it's pretty clear the Weimar Republic was in deep trouble if something wasn't done to help them. Help them fight inflation, help them pay the reparations, and help defeat people who were rising up against them, whether they were communists or the soldiers or nationalists. People were rising up against them. So the United States came up with something called the Dawes Plan. The Dawes Plan loaned Germany American money, gave them US dollars to pay the reparations. In conjunction with this, as part of the Dawes Plan, as soon as Germany gave money to England, one of the allies, to pay off their reparations debt, England was obliged to spend that money on American goods. So the US was going to get the money back twice. This was a genius move because the Allies had the money to buy American goods, and the Germans were going to pay back the money eventually. So the US would actually get the money back 2 times over. It was a pretty clever move, actually. Because it started to kind of calm down in Germany with this help from the American economy, or the American loans, the Weimar Republic became more popular. So once the economy settled down, Weimar Germany became a cultural and social hotspot. It entered into a golden age. It became the home of modern architecture and design. This was called the Bauhaus movement. These are houses that are very sleek and modern looking. If you've ever seen the show The Brady Bunch, that kind of a house, this mid-century design house, comes from the Bauhaus movement. It also was a hotbed of intellectual thought. In 1921, there was this guy named Albert Einstein, who was a German living in Germany, coming up with all these big ideas like the theory of relativity. He won the Nobel Prize in 1921 as a German. Now, by the late 1920s, he's going to pack his bags and move to the US. But at that time, lots and lots of scientists were living in Germany. Schools and colleges were booming because they were free. Theater and film and art and music flourished. Philosophy flourished. And even exercise science, like the beginning of something called Pilates. If you've ever gone to like a yoga studio, you may have seen that part of it is a Pilates studio, using kind of your own body weight to make you stronger. That started in Germany during this time. Some of the art that came from this period is called Dada, the Dada movement, and it is pretty cuckoo. When you, oopsie daisy, when you go through these notes on your own, you're going to stop me and you're going to watch this short little 3-minute video that's posted at the bottom here. Now, the Weimar Republic became kind of a safe haven for Americans, especially Black Americans. During World War I, many Black American soldiers, African American soldiers, volunteered to join the army. And they thought, hey, if I go in the army and fight in World War I, Americans are going to not treat me like trash anymore. I've sacrificed my family time. I've sacrificed my physical health and my physical safety to fight for America. I'll be taken care of. But instead, they returned to America, and even in the U.S. Army, saw that they were being treated with racism and violence. So after the war ended, many American soldiers, especially Black American soldiers, stayed in Germany. They found that they had more opportunities there, whether they were cultural opportunities, economic opportunities, or intellectual opportunities. Some American soldiers went back to America and tried to set up lives there, kind of refigure their lives with their wives and their children, and became victims of violence from the Ku Klux Klan, which was thriving in the 1920s. They packed up their dolls and dishes and moved back to Germany and made their mark in Germany at that time. Most of them did have to leave in the 1930s because of Adolf Hitler. Now, because of the Weimar Republic's unpopularity, because of its mishandling of the economy, many people formed coalitions to defeat them. Some of them were communist, and some of them were very, very anti-communist. The most prominent of which is called the NSDAP, or the National Socialist German Workers' Party. This is going to become known as the Nazi Party. The NSDAP was a nationalistic, anti-democratic, and anti-Semitic, which is a group that hates Jews, group that wanted to counteract the Weimar Republic. They even called the Weimar Republic the stab-in-the-back government. They called them that because of what happened with the Treaty of Versailles. The NSDAP had 3 main ideas. Jews were a threat to Germans and all Aryans. All members of the party, and after 1933, as we're going to see in a second, all citizens of Germany must adhere to the Führer principle, which means they have to be obedient to the will of the leader. You cannot question the Führer. Führer means leader. And Germans must have more Lebensraum. They need more living space. And that living space should be taken from inferior people in Eastern Europe, like the Poles, like the Czechs, like the Slovaks, and eventually like the Germans. So Adolf Hitler was an army veteran. He had fought in World War I, and he had come back to his, stayed in Germany. He was actually from Austria. He stayed in Germany and wanted to become an artist, and he did not make it as an artist. He was kicked out of art school. He was living in a flop house, which is like a really, really cheap men's hotel, and he just couldn't find work. His life stunk. So because of hyperinflation and harsh provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, the NSDAP, or the Nazi Party, began to gain followers, and one of them that quickly rose to the top was Adolf Hitler. And in 1923, on November 9th, 1923, after spending a whole day at a beer garden, or what's called a beer hall, Hitler and his pals decided, you know what we ought to do? We ought to take over the government. We ought to take over the government of Bavaria. Bavaria was a German state, like New York is a German state, or Pennsylvania, or American state, or Pennsylvania is an American state. Now, it's important for you to know, Hitler does not drink. He does a lot of other things, but he does not drink alcohol. They do think he was addicted to cocaine eye drops, but he does not drink beer. So everybody else is hammered, and Hitler is sober. So he gets all his buddies in the NSDAP to follow him. Let's go to the Capitol, and let's take over. Well, guess what? This didn't work. This is called the Munich Beer Hall Putsch. A putsch is a German word for taking over the government, and it did not work. Hitler was found to be the organizer of this. He was sentenced to jail for 5 years. He only served 9 months. But while he was in jail, he wrote a book, kind of passing the time, called Mein Kampf. And some of you may have heard of the book Mein Kampf. Some of you may even have seen the book Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf means my struggle. This was a book outlining his philosophy of hatred, his philosophy of nationalism, his philosophy of German overlord status. And it also spelled out his blueprint for taking over Germany and destroying all the Jews. One of his chapters in Mein Kampf is called The Final Solution. Now, because the Weimar government is doing better, its economy is kind of getting its act together, they say, you know what, we should start thinking about some other reforms. Let's think about maybe we should think about maybe trying these reforms. They hadn't done them. They hadn't moved in this direction. They just said, maybe we should talk about these someday. They talked about nationalizing big business. To nationalize means the government takes over ownership. And they talked about dividing large estates. This means taking people who own tons and tons and tons of land and letting them keep a smidge, but giving the rest to the landless masses. Now, both of these things are characteristics you might find in communism. So this had people a little concerned. So this kind of talk about communism and this kind of liberal reforms proposed in the Constitution of the Weimar Republic already had things kind of teetering. But things really went over the edge in October of 1929 during the Great Depression. When the stock market crashed in the United States, it had a ripple effect on all the economies of the world. Unemployment around the world, especially in Germany, went through the roof. And the United States, who had loaned Germany millions and millions of dollars to pay off their loans, pay off their reparations, the U.S. wanted that money back now. The Weimar Republic didn't have that money, and they knew they were in big trouble. About a year later, there are elections. In these elections, the Nazi Party wins a ton of seats in parliament. Now remember, there's lots and lots of parties in Germany. And if one party can win 25% of the vote, they are doing pretty well. The Nazi Party wins 25% of the vote. The Nazi Party is against the Weimar Republic. They're against communism, and they're against Jews. They said that the Jews were the reason the Germans lost World War I. They said that Jews were the reason that Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles, and that Jews were taking their jobs. A couple years later is the presidential election. Adolf Hitler runs for president, but he loses. But it's kind of close. The guy who wins, he's the incumbent, his name is Paul von Hindenburg, thought it was way closer than he wanted. He said, I got to find a way to keep the Nazis happy and keep Hitler out of my hair. So he gave them the job of chancellor. The chancellor of Germany, we already said this is the same job that Otto von Bismarck had. One of the duties of the chancellor of Germany is to decide what laws are going to go before parliament. And he's going to propose a law called the Enabling Act. The Enabling Act came up because Parliament's building was burned down. In February of 1933, the Reichstag, the place where Parliament met, was burned to the ground. And it's a pretty sure bet, although no one ever confessed to it, that it was burned down by the Nazis. The Reichstag was a building where the German Parliament met. The remains left in the fire that were found around the fire were communist propaganda. At the scene of the fire was a well-known Dutchman who was a well-known communist. He just happened to be there. So the Nazi Party blamed it on the communist and said, now we have an emergency. We've got to save our country. We've got to save the Weimar government. Now, we all know they don't really like the Weimar government, so this was a bunch of hooey. So as you guys know, in the Constitution, we saw way back near the beginning of this, the Weimar Constitution has a provision that allowed for a dictatorship if there is an emergency. They never said what an emergency had to be. They just said there had to be an emergency. So the Enabling Act in 1933 that Hitler proposed said the following. Hitler, the chancellor, can pass any law he wants to without the approval of Parliament. So let that sink in. Hitler can pass any law with no one's approval. So he used democracy. He used his democratically appointed position. He used the burning of the Reichstag to make himself a dictator. He took it one step further in July of 1933 when he made it the law saying that the Nazi Party is the only legal political party in Germany, and Hitler is the only ruler. You're going to watch this video when you're done at the bottom of the screen.